Hello, everyone. Welcome to another enlightening episode of the Scholars Table. I'm Dr. Banda Khalifa, your host, PhD student at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today, we are diving into one of the critical aspects of academic advancement, which is the PhD application process. We are specifically focusing on the interview process. We are privileged to have Professor Priya Duggal, who is a renowned figure in epidemiology and genetics at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Professor Duggal currently serves as the Vice Chair for Faculty in the Department of Epidemiology and brings a wealth of knowledge and experience that is invaluable for anyone stepping into doctoral studies. Her expertise spans important research in infectious diseases and genetic epidemiology and encompasses a deep understanding of what it takes to succeed in a highly competitive academic environment. She has a PhD from Hopkins and also an MPH from Hopkins. As many of our listeners are gearing up for their PhD interviews, Professor Duggal insights today are more invaluable, more relevant than ever. We will discuss key strategies, common challenges, common questions, and effective preparation techniques for PhD interviews. So stay tuned as we explore these topics. Without wasting much time, let me invite our special guest, Professor Duggal, to the Scholars Table. Good morning, Professor Duggal, and thank you for joining us today. We are really excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Banda. It's great to be here.
All right, so I know we've tried so many times to make this happen, so I'm finally excited that you are here with us, and I'm sure a lot of prospective applicants would benefit immensely from our conversation today. But before we begin, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, how you discovered your interest in epidemiology, and how has your experience been so far being in the academic field?
Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of stumbled into the area of epidemiology. It wasn't an area that I knew a lot about initially. I was actually a comparative and international politics major in college. I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And then I worked for a couple years in Boston at Harvard Medical School in a lab working on genetics. And so I sort of had always sort of this interest perhaps in medicine, but also in doing research, but really I think also in helping people by looking at data. And that's some of what I did in my work and in sort of looking at the politics of how governments are run. And what I didn't know is that there was this whole field that was sort of thinking about that in the area of international health. And so as I was doing some of this genetic research, I decided to apply to graduate schools. And one of them was Johns Hopkins, specifically to do their master's in public health. And I was drawn to Johns Hopkins because it has such a strong presence in the international world in terms of the types of research it does. And I thought that this one-year program, 11 months, would be great. It would be a great start for me to think about what these things were. And again, at this point, I didn't really even know that epidemiology existed. I knew that biostatistics did, but I didn't even know EPI existed. So I came to Hopkins. I had some amazing professors. I talked to some folks early on. As you know, the MPH class at Johns Hopkins is pretty amazing because you can have health ministers in your class and you can have really young, recent graduates like myself in a class. And so you have this breadth of people with a lot of different experience and a lot of different views. And so in that, I spoke to some faculty who said, you're sort of on the younger side. This is a moment to think about the wisdom that people give you, right? And they said it'd be really important for you to either consider going to medical school and becoming a physician and doing some of the things that you hope to do, or becoming an epidemiologist or a statistician that can assist with the work that's being done in these countries. And I was taking, the beginning, at that time, 601 epidemiology course, and it was easy. It sort of all came to me more naturally than I had expected. And I decided to apply for the PhD in epidemiology, and with my background in genetics and a lot of interest in understanding the root cause of disease and then applying it to populations, I pursued my PhD in genetic epi at Johns Hopkins. Um, and my focus has always been on infectious diseases, specifically trying to understand why some people have specific outcomes or any outcome following an infection and others don't, with an emphasis both on the pathogen and on the host. And so I completed my PhD at Johns Hopkins, and then I actually was at the NIH for almost 6 years, working in the area at the National Human Genome Research Institute, asking a lot of these questions in both infectious diseases, but also looking at cancer and eye diseases. And then I was lured back to Johns Hopkins, where I've been on faculty for many years.
Yeah, we hear the story. We always hear stories of people or faculty saying, "Oh, they just came to Hopkins to, just for a few years, and then by the time they realize they are, they've spent over a decade at Hopkins." So I guess, I mean, the environment it's a thriving environment.
It is, right? I mean, it sort of sucks you in and you don't realize it. I came for 11 months and, I've been in Baltimore for more than 25 years. So it's sort of crazy, right? When you think
Yes.
about what it does, but it does speak to the people, the colleagues, the research, the quality of the research that's being
Yeah.
done that keeps us all here.
That's true. That's true. Okay, so a lot of my listeners are prospective applicants or early career professionals. So I think that whilst we have you here, it would be very important to talk about the PhD application process itself. So being at Hopkins for over 20 years, from your perspective, what are the key components of a successful application, a PhD application in particular?
Yeah, so really good question, and I think a hard one for all of those students that have been applying, all of those people thinking about programs. But what we really want to see in a PhD application is authenticity, right? We want to see who you are. We want to know who you are. And I think sometimes people are crafting their personal statements or they're looking at the projects they've done and trying to reach some sort of perfection, right? There's no gold standard in the application process. There's just none. You don't have to have a specific pedigree or a specific way of doing things. What you have to have is motivation for why you're doing it. And you
Okay.
have to learn from every single one of your experiences. And you have to tell us that story. And the more you tell us of that story, you're also telling us why you want to be at Johns Hopkins or why you want to be at any university applying for these positions. And that's what we want to see. So it sounds simple. I know it's hard, but it really is just getting back, asking yourself, why do I want to do a PhD? And why do I want to go to this university to do a PhD?
Okay. So your motivation, having a clear motivation, and then being authentic with yourself. Okay. I think another aspect that commonly comes out is how to effectively showcase your research interests, like so your motivation and your academic potential in the application. How can students typically showcase their motivation or research interest in the application?
Yeah, so it's sort of exciting. And I think that a lot of us end up doing something in research that's just convenient, meaning like that was the job I got or that was the opening. But what did you learn from that experience? And I've had students who, for example, worked in the lab and they loved it. And they were like, that is what I want to do. And then I've had other students who've worked in the lab and they knew right as soon as they were there that this was not for them. And so I think being able to convey that message, like I worked in this lab and as excited as I was and as interested as I was in the research, I learned from this that I'd rather work with people or I'd rather work, with data. And I think that you can, as you're telling your story about your research and showcasing it, we're not as impressed with what the accomplishment was of that research, because we know that was a team effort. It's very unlikely that someone applying for a PhD has led everything to that point, right? You didn't
Yes.
get the funding, you didn't make it all happen. So we're more interested in what you learned and what your specific contributions were. And if you were a part of the discussion, were you there as the paper was being written? Were you reviewing drafts of it? Were you there as they were thinking about the IRB, or other little aspects of things? As you tell us that story, we understand then what your involvement was.
All right. So I know, like I've been getting a lot of messages, a lot of calls on from students or prospective applicants who are, either waiting to interview for programs, getting ready to interview for PhD programs. So talking about the interview process itself, I think it's worth doing. So for students preparing for interviews, especially PhD and to some extent DRPH interviews, in your experience, what are the most important aspects candidates should prepare for in PhD interviews?
So I think there's going to be some obvious questions that almost every PhD interview asks, right? We're going to ask you to tell us about yourself. We're going to ask you to tell us why you're looking at this university or why you're pursuing this PhD. So practice that. Think about the reasoning behind it, and be honest, right? And maybe if you're not comfortable in an interview process, work with a friend. Just sort of talk through those questions, and they won't be a surprise to you, right? Some of it is just the more you do this, the easier it gets. And for a lot of people, this is the first interview process they have. So don't be afraid to just sit down with someone and practice those, but those are coming, right? And so what we don't want to hear is the sort of surface things. There's no formula. Like, I'm not looking for you to say something specific, right? I'm looking to hear who you are and why you want to be there. And the one thing that sometimes I think prospective applicants forget about, because they're looking at a lot of universities, is they don't do their homework. So they don't look at the faculty in that department or the research that comes out of that department. And it doesn't have to be the flashy stuff. It doesn't have to be, it can be what you want to do. Why and who do you want to work with? Because, as you're going to be working with that group of faculty for a lot of years. So is that the type of work you want to do? Because we want a good match, right? We want people that want to work with us and answer the questions that we collectively can answer.
Are there any specific strategies or areas that applicants could, focus in order to effectively communicate their ideas or their research interests during the interview?
Yes, I think that tying some of the work that you've done to the work that's being done, right? So, for example, if you worked in Africa with a specific population and that's what's driving you to apply to a specific university because they do work in that area, then talk about your work and talk about how you're inspired or you're interested or you're intrigued by the work that this university is doing or these investigators are doing in that country. And that takes homework, right? You can't, I think the difference sometimes between a master's program and a PhD program is that a master's program has a lot of what we consider didactic coursework. You're learning courses, you're learning coursework so that you can use those skills as you go forward. But for a PhD, we're looking for people who can think. We're looking for people who want to think and who want to ask questions. And so for that, you have to do quite a bit of homework about the programs you're applying to and the people that are in those programs.
Okay. All right. So bottom line is do your homework and know exactly those that you'll be talking with.
I might just add one thing that, often in this interview process, it depends on the school. Sometimes it's an admissions team that's asking you for the interview. Sometimes it's a specific individual. So when you do that homework, it's about the department that you're applying to, not necessarily the interviewers, because the interviewers are just representing the group. Sometimes your interviewer might be who you want to work with. That's great. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. So each school or each program does it a little differently.
Okay. All right. So, mentioned that if you're walking into a PhD interview, you know questions that most certainly will appear. So I want us to look at these questions and how students can better respond to these questions. So if you could kindly take us through some common questions that PhD applicants should expect in their PhD interviews.
Yeah, so I think that we're going to ask you to tell us about yourself. We're going to ask you why you want to do a PhD. We're going to ask you why you want to be at this specific university. We're going to ask you about the research you've already done, and then the research you're interested in doing. And then we're going to ask you about your future plans. Like, where do you plan to go and what do you plan to do? What is sort of your vision going forward? Those are some of the common questions you're going to get.
Okay, all right. So, in your experience, is it possible to, for example, share examples of impressive or, let's say, compelling responses, or like any strategies or approaches that you've identified that works well for answering some of these common questions? Maybe we could start from a question like, tell me about yourself.
Yeah, I think that, again, this authenticity is really important. So what we want to know is, what's your background been? Where have you come from? Why do you want to be here? Right? So when we tell us about yourself, maybe we have your details. Like, we know what schools you went to. We know all of that. So keep that brief. Like, I went to this college. I got a master's here. I did research here. So keep that brief overall because we can see it, but get us to why that led you to this PhD, right? What is it about all of this path that you've taken that got you to wanting to pursue a PhD? Those are the most impressive people because they sort of walk you through a story. They're telling you something.
Okay.
Overall.
Okay. So it's more like telling a story that ties everything together. Not just narrating everything on your resume again.
That's
okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And and if some things don't tie together, tell us they didn't tie together. I went off and decided to go to cooking school for 2 years. You can tell us that, right? If that's what you did. And I just thought I'd pursue something. I actually think someone said that in an interview.
Okay.
And I was sort of impressed. I was impressed that they went to cooking school for 2 years because they what they said in response was, but then I realized what I really wanted to do was research, right? I had that moment. I had that clarity. I had that sense of like, am I sure I want to do this? I went and tried to pursue something else, and now I'm back, and I'm back and I'm strong, right? That's impressive.
Yeah.
That's real.
That's true. I think most often students are a bit scared of talking about things that are not related to the program because they think that might be a negative a negative mark on their performance. But as you've said, some of these stories make even your whole application more compelling to interviewers. Okay, so how about why do you want to pursue a PhD? I think that is also one question that seems to come up a lot.
Yeah, so this is not one where I can give you an answer because I think it's so personal, right? Like, I think that people have to really think deep and ask themselves, why do I want this? Because I'm going to be honest, it's not easy, right? It is a long haul to get a PhD. It's not like any other educational endeavor that you would have taken until that point where you take classes and you take tests, and if you do well, then you pass, right? That's true for the first couple of years of some people's PhD programs. But for almost all other PhD programs in the sciences, from the laboratory to the population sciences, it's then about you performing, you doing the research, you asking the questions and answering them and writing and communicating. And so you have to tell us why you want that, right? And sometimes it's about the end goal, right? I want to do this because I want to be an academic. I want to do this because I want to run a nonprofit. I want to do this because I want to work for the Gates Foundation. Whatever it is that you want to do, you can tell us that end result. But if we don't believe that you have one, then it feels like you're just going through the motions, right?
Okay. All right. So how about I know, like, there have been instances where people think that they if they convey their future plan of not being in academia, it's like a negative impression on them. Can you clarify whether it's a must to say I want to be in academia, post my PhD, or I'm getting a PhD so I can go straight to industry?
So I would say in our program, that's not a negative, right? So I can speak for our program that you telling us where you want to go and why you want to go there is valued. And we know that not most people are going to go into academia. And we're okay with that. We think there are a lot of great job opportunities, and our alums have gone in lots of different directions and have been very successful. So I think one way when you don't know a program per se is to ask that question when you think about it and say, where do your graduates go? Where do your PhD graduates go on? And when you hear that answer, if they all go into academia, right, then you know that this program is setting you up for academia and only academia. And if you hear a program say, they go to industry or they go into nonprofit work or non-governmental work or governmental work or academia, I think you have a better sense of what the department would accept in the application process. And you could ask that, in the interview process, but you could also ask that of the admissions coordinator that you can reach out to in advance and say, can you give me a little bit more details? Most departments have that type of information available.
Okay, all right. I think that's fair. How about, what are your research interests? I think this is one of the questions that you most certainly 100% know they're going to ask you. So how can applicants convey their research interests effectively?
Yeah, so this is a good one, Banda, because I think a lot of people tell us what they think we want to hear. I think that when I interview someone suddenly has this really strong interest in working in genetics and infectious diseases, and they've never done that before, right? I can promise you, when I'm interviewing you, I don't want you to be just like me, right? I want you to be you. I want you to be the person that is going to go out in the world and do amazing things. And so I think be honest. But if you say, for example, you want to work in an area that our department doesn't support, then I think that's something we have to think about, because why are you coming here, right? Like if you want to work in a disease, for epidemiology in a disease area that none of us as faculty specialize in, it's going to be hard to find a match. And that's why I said, think about, why you want to be at that department. But otherwise, tell us your research interests and tell us the motivation behind those research interests. And don't make it personal. I think a lot of people might be motivated, for example, because they had a relative who died of a heart attack or of cancer or something. And that's definitely a personal motivation. But I think really we don't drive all of our careers based on that one incident. Some people do, but it's very rare. So think about really why you want to study an area or what your research interests are. And for some folks, it's going to be methodologic or laboratory based, and others it's going to be because they want to solve a problem. And I think if we hear that, we know that's what's motivating you.
Okay, all right. I think this has been clearly communicated. How do you plan to contribute to our program or department? What are some of the expectations that the school or interviewers are expecting applicants to convey?
Yeah, so when you think about a doctoral student and what their role is in a department, right? So they're there to learn, both by learning in class, but also as an apprentice in a part of a laboratory group. So, I think your contributions can be in any of those areas, but then also once you've learned, we ask our doctoral students to serve as teaching assistants. So thinking about those types of contributions, or participating in journal clubs or seminars, or leading things that will drive the student organizations as a part of your university. Those are all contributions overall. So you don't have to be as specific that, I'm going to join this student organization and do this work. But I think what we want to hear is that you want to be an active member and engaged in our department. right? That you're here to contribute what you have to offer, as well as to learn and take what others have to offer, because that's what it's about. It's a 4, 5, 6 year experience of give and take, right? So.
Yeah, I get scared when you add 6 years to it. Um, so, so a question like, how do you or how have you prepared for the PhD program? How should that be handled?
So the things that we look for, right, and we've already looked at your application before we get to the interview process, is we look to see, have you taken the necessary classwork or coursework, and have you performed well in those courses? And well doesn't have to be an A, but it should be that you've mastered a topic and you've sort of committed to doing well in those areas. And so we usually already know about your coursework, but if you feel that it's important to highlight that coursework or something specific about it in terms of your research preparation, let's say you want to do work in mental health, right? That you've taken specific courses in mental health or you understand them. So let's say you want to do epidemiology, that you've taken an intro course in epidemiology. Again, you don't have to have always done all of these, but if that's important and you need to highlight it, then highlight it. The other piece of this is the research you've done, and I would say the breadth of research that people have experienced, as well as the depth of research, right? So we really like to see people that have been embedded in a research program and have some product from it, whether it be an abstract or a paper or something that they've contributed to that really carries a lot of weight, and you should highlight it. You know, my work led to a manuscript, or my work led to a presentation at this conference. Those are things that we want to see and hear from you. But just as much, if you don't have that, talking about that research experience and how it influenced you and what you learned from it.
Okay. Thank you so much for elaborating on that. But I know that there are instances where the common questions that are likely to come, and once in a while you'll be met with some challenging questions or unexpected questions. So how can applicants maintain their composure, and how should they approach to challenging or unexpected questions in their PhD interview?
Okay, that's a great question. So a couple of things. First, take a deep breath, right? Take a moment, replay that question in your head. If you understood it, then process it and work towards it. If you didn't follow the question or you're not sure, just ask the interviewer to repeat it, right? Just say, I'm not sure I followed the question. Could you repeat it for me? And that also gives you a moment to breathe and to think through that question, and then just answer it as best you can. I can tell you that no interviewer is trying to trick you in this admissions process. No one's trying to stump you unless they tell you, I'm trying to stump you, right? But most of us are not trying to do that. We're just trying to get at who you are and to understand how you think about a process. And so sometimes questions are going to be, about maybe a recent event in the world. Maybe it'll be like right now about the pandemic and how would you have responded to it. Just do your best and think through that process of how you would want to address it. But often those questions don't have a right or wrong answer. They're just us trying to understand how you're thinking.
Okay. Is it common for applicants to be asked very content-driven questions? So, for example, for them to talk through, the methodology of their recent paper, or maybe a specific definitions in their field of study. How common are those questions?
Those aren't really common questions. I think that the way that it could be a little bit more in depth is if you told me you were working on a specific project and it led to, this finding. We might say, well, tell me a little bit about the methods you used or how you chose to approach it. Tell me about how you learned to do those methods, or learned to do those. How did you tabulate those results? So it should be within the realm of what you've done, not asking you to know the literature and talk about things you don't know. That's not, it's not you'll have those once you're in a PhD program in your preliminary oral exams, but that's not what this is. This is just trying to understand what your contributions were, and if you understand what you were a part of.
So far, I've also learned a lot from our conversation, especially with respect to the interview process itself. There are also instances where people reach out and say a particular school is asking them about their research proposal and other things. And I know for the past couple of terms or past couple of months, I've had the privilege of being in your class and learning about the research process, learning about research proposal, refining your aims and all that, which I think it's a very critical aspect. But for PhD applicants, how important is a research proposal in their PhD interview process? And what typically makes a proposal like stands out if a program requires it?
Yeah, it's a good question and a unique question, because at a place like our program at Johns Hopkins, and I actually think at all of the Johns Hopkins programs, we don't require that, and that's because of the way that we handle our funding to our students. But there are many programs that ask for that, specifically because they're going to match you, pair you with an investigator who's then going to have you on their specific grants, and that's how you're going to get funded. And so in that case, I think it's really important, as you think about those research proposals, to think about who you're working with, to do your homework and read their papers, to think about the questions you want to ask that they haven't asked, that haven't been there. It's just a very different approach, and it's something really that maybe the people watching this should think about when you think about a program. Are you paired with someone before you even get there, or are you going to a program to learn and discover who you will be with, and you've identified people you want to work with? It's just that approach is different, and so you start that research proposal piece much earlier if you're already getting paired with them. So that means you have to do all your homework a lot earlier, because they're basically picking you to work with them. Whereas at a program like Hopkins, the admissions team is picking you to be one of our doctoral students.
All right. So how about talking about some do's and don'ts in the PhD interview? Are there any important etiquettes that applicants must adhere to in a PhD interview, whether it's remote or it's in person?
I think that think about how people address themselves. I think that academia is still a relatively formal place on the outside. So I would probably, as an applicant, refrain from calling people by their first names in this process. As you know, once you're on campus and once you're a part of a team, most academics are very comfortable with first names. But in this process, in terms of etiquette, I'd probably refer to someone as Dr. Khalifa, and not as Banda in that process. And I think that you should think about questions. I think this is a two-way street in this process. We're telling you, we're asking you questions to learn more about you, but it's also a really important opportunity for you to ask questions to learn about where you might be spending, the next 4 or 5 years of your life. And I don't mean just the location, which is important, but the people, the values, the things that are happening in that community. Might have lost you, Banda. There you
go. Yeah. So, are there any specific strategies that candidates can use in their interaction with interview panel to make a positive impression? Especially if it's like remote. I don't know, but just want to find out.
Yeah, I think just nice kindness, being polite. I think all of those are welcome. I can't imagine anyone listening to this would do anything but that. I've never experienced anyone in an interview process not being, not exuding excellent etiquette and behavior. And I think just remembering that, whether it's online or in person, you're still treating people with the respect that is due to them on both sides. And I want to stress that if you don't feel like you're being respected, it also speaks volumes, right, about the program you're considering. So it should go both ways, both about time that's being spent, questions, and the whole setup.
All right. So I want us to also look at the post-interview phase. Before that, let's talk about common mistakes to avoid. So, like, based on your experience, what are some of the common mistakes that candidates have made during the interview, and how can they avoid these mistakes?
I think one common mistake is that people get nervous, and when they get nervous, they don't always hear the question or they misunderstand the question. And so I think asking for clarity, asking, I'm sorry I didn't follow that question. Or if you're not even sure you answered the right question, just saying, I just want to make sure that did I answer the question fully? Was I complete in what you needed to hear? Something so that you don't leave them with the impression that you're answering a question that they didn't even ask, right? So that's just, don't be intimidated by your interviewers. They want to hear your answer. And I know that's easier said than done, but I'm telling you as an interviewer, I'd rather you answer the question I asked than something you think I asked. I think the other thing is just, nobody wants someone to brag about what they've done. But if you're proud of your accomplishments and you've done things, don't hesitate to tell us. And that's what I meant before. If you've published a paper, tell us that you published that paper. You can say it in a really wonderful way of, this work led to this publication in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Or I was privileged to be able to go and speak at the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, right? There are ways to say it instead of, let me tell you, all my papers and all my talks, right? So those are some simple ways for you to make sure you've highlighted things that you think people are going to want to hear.
Okay. All right. So I want us to look at the post-interview phase. Is it advisable to send like a follow-up email saying thank you and all that, or it's like it doesn't hurt your chances if you don't do any of that?
So I'm a little old school here, and I think that if it doesn't take much effort now to send an email, and I think that anytime you can send a thank you, it's well received. I know that others may not feel that, and you may not get a response from that. It may not follow up, but one way to do it is to just to remind people that you just had that interview. So maybe wait a little bit, a day, and send an email that says, thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot. You can highlight what you learned, something interesting or new. And if you have a question, that's a great time to ask that question. I also wanted to follow up on this question. If you don't, that's okay too. But I think that having that communication is important. Because remember, those interviewers are assessing you and you're assessing them. And so keeping you fresh in that mindset is important. I don't think you need to do much more beyond that, because I think that, as you know, faculty are super busy. And so what you don't want to do is flood them, with requests every week, or just an update. Just one is simple. That's enough. And it'll be well received.
Okay. All right. That's so towards the end of the interview, most often students are asked, do you have any questions for us? How do you think applicants should approach this? Either they should say, I don't have any questions, or if they have to ask a question, what are some of the questions that you think are compelling enough for students to ask?
Great question. So please don't ever end an interview, any interview, a job interview or an interview for a PhD, by saying you don't have any questions. Because it tells me a couple different things. It tells me either you're intimidated and you don't want to ask me a question, you're overwhelmed and you don't want to ask a question, or you really haven't done enough to be able to ask a question. You haven't figured things out enough. So there are lots of great questions. There are simple questions, that we even started with, what brought you to Johns Hopkins, or what brought you into this department? That gets you to know the speaker. That's an easy question. If there isn't a lot of time and you want to ask a specific question, ask your specific question. Can you tell me more about this training program? I'm really interested in this fellowship. What would be the process as a doctoral student to apply for that? You could ask about the ability of students to travel for conferences. How is that handled? Those are questions. You could ask a question about diversity and equity in the department. You can ask pretty much any question of those faculty that is important to you. You should be asking them. And you often don't have that much time, so prioritize what you think there is. And you usually only have one interview, maybe with a couple people, but only one interview. So there hasn't been, 10 interviews like you have for a job where someone else has answered that question for you. This is a moment where whatever questions you've got, you can ask them. I think the questions, some people ask a simple question of, what are the next steps? When will I hear from people? Those are important as well, but often that's relayed to you either in an email or by the person conducting the interview in advance.
Okay. I think this has been like very, very enlightening. Knowing exactly like the kind of questions you have to ask, and always making sure you have something to ask, during the end of the interview. So, I mean, I know we've been speaking for the past 40 minutes, and it's been very, very insightful. What advice do you have for international students who are applying to a PhD or who are interviewing for a PhD, given the different cultural and educational context?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we have a lot of international students that come into our department. So I think, and this is true for both international and non-international students. Ask the interviewer if there's an opportunity to talk to students in the department. I think that is a great way, and many of the times we will say yes. I mean, I always say yes, and I don't moderate that conversation. We ask students to just have a conversation. So that gives you another way to talk to other people, maybe from your country or from your culture, and see how things work at the university you're applying to. See if there's support. See if there's a good international office that's going to support you in the process. I mean, there's a lot of details that go in when you're an international student, but there's also a cultural aspect of, is there a community that I can be a part of? Is there services? I know several years ago, I had a student from China that actually led sessions in Chinese on different topics that we were doing for across our school, not just in our department, specifically because people said they couldn't follow what some of the messaging was in these big sessions. And so, that's something where I'd say that's great to know that there are students that are devoted and interested in helping the rest of their community.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Before we go, any final words to your current students, including myself and those of us who are starting to feel the heat of putting together our proposals?
They do need to get their proposals in. They know that I insist on it all the time, and it's only in their best interest. I think remember that faculty they were in your shoes maybe many years ago, but they were in your shoes, and they know what this process is, but they also know what it takes to succeed. And so they're looking for those traits, and they're looking for the traits of people who are resilient, who are strong, who are persistent, and who are motivated. And as long as you can exude those traits in both writing your research proposal, but in your application process, it'll come through, and it'll come through in the story you're trying to tell. So good luck. We welcome this. This is so exciting. We love having students in this process. So it's really, it's an exciting time.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited about this conversation, and I think viewers are going to benefit so much from listening to this conversation. So thank you so much, and I'll see you again next week in school.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Take care.
You too.